Welcome to this Urbanism Next virtual forum breakout group. We are going to be talking today about the Transportation Holy Grail, Mobility as a Service, or MaaS, and mobility management. My name is Regina Clewlow. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Populus. Delighted to have you join us today for this virtual conversation. Before we get started, I want to introduce our illustrious panelists who have joined us here today. They're going to each give a quick introduction with slides a bit later in our presentation. So I'll do just a quick introduction now. First off, we have Gary Thomas, who is the former executive director and president of DART in Dallas. Thank you for joining us, Gary. And we have Gillian Gillett from the program manager of California Integrated Transport from Caltrans, and many other positions previous to that in the mobility space. And then we have Andrew Salzberg, head of policy at Transit, also formerly transportation policy at Uber. And then from the Populus team, we have Elliot Muting, who is a mobility partnerships manager, who's going to be supporting us in this session, fielding some great questions from the audience, so keep them coming. So our illustrious panel, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a brief introduction to the concept of mobility as a service to provide a bit of framing and level setting for the rest of our conversation. The term mobility as a service is often thrown around to refer to on-demand mobility services like Uber and Lyft, but more frequently, at least in transportation circles, the term MaaS typically refers to the concept where multimodal transportation services, including shared bikes, scooters, Ubers, public transit, are all bundled into one consumer-facing app that includes journey planning, book and pay, based on a framework that was developed years ago by an academic researcher referenced here. Level 4 MaaS not only integrates these services, but also includes the option to purchase transportation bundles and is much more explicitly designed to achieve societal goals, such as reducing congestion, carbon emissions, and expanding equity. I've long thought that the only way to achieve level 4 MaaS is for public agencies to play a central role and to invest in robust city-facing solutions that I would describe as mobility management. Mobility management on the left-hand side of the system describes the city-facing data-driven solutions that actually allow public transit agencies to help ensure that societal goals are being prioritized. There are a number of key levers that public agencies have at their disposal, including pricing streets and curbs, subsidizing lower carbon modes, including mass transit and micromobility, and defining road rules that reduce congestion and pollution. And so by leveraging mobility management solutions, cities can more effectively deliver incentives and policies to mobility operators directly, as well as indirectly through integrated mobility as a service applications to achieve public outcomes that we espouse to. For those of you who may be a bit less familiar with Populus, Populus is a city mobility management platform company that empowers cities around the world to manage their curbs, streets, and sidewalks with access to data from mobility operators. We currently deliver real-time mobility data in over 80 cities around the world, from Buenos Aires to Oakland to Tel Aviv, including for shared scooters, bikes, mopeds, and car sharing. As the mobility data sharing and mobility management policies, as those have evolved over time and expand in cities both large and small, we've really been working hard to support them in managing the future of transportation. And one of the things I want to highlight for the participants is that you can also download a recent report that we produced, which really touches on and tries to pull together both the concept of mobility as a service, specifically elaborate on the roles of the private and public sectors, and how it feeds into mobility management, the role of mobility data, the levers of pricing and subsidies, and then the key technical building blocks for effective MaaS and mobility management. So I've provided the link there, and we'll share that in the chat as well. As I move on from this framing, I'd like to now introduce Andrew Salzberg, who's going to speak with us about his views on MaaS. Welcome, Andrew.
Great, thanks, Regina. So yeah, if you don't know Transit App, we are the largest public transportation trip planning app in North America. So after Google, essentially, but we're one of the ones that's focused on everything that isn't your own car. So I think a lot of what Regina was talking about in terms of consumer-facing MaaS is exactly what we're doing. This is a sample of a screenshot of what the app looks like. I'm in Montreal, where transit is based. And actually, when you're here, it's not only that you can plan trips across multiple modes, which you can do in a couple hundred markets around the world. There are increasingly places where you can actually purchase and unlock a ticket, either on a transit trip or on a new shared mobility mode. And here in Montreal, you can actually buy a bus ticket and unlock a bike share bike without having to create a new account, despite those being two different operators. And so that, I think, is one of those levels of MaaS that Regina was talking about that we're excited about, and that hasn't actually happened in many places. So we're making that live in a couple of markets and a growing number across North America and around the world. If you go to the next slide. Regina, next slide. Can I do it? No, you got to do it. Yes. Okay, great. So in addition to being a consumer-facing mobility as a service, trip planning and purchasing app, we are also the endorsed partner of a wide variety of public transportation agencies across North America. So most recently, in the bottom right corner there, you can see LA Metro has now endorsed Transit as their official app. That goes alongside agencies like the MBTA in Boston and the STM in Montreal, some of the biggest transit agencies in North America, who have endorsed Transit as their consumer-facing app rather than developing their own white label app from scratch. We think that's a better approach ultimately to deliver the consumer experience people are looking for, and to build something that can bring transit to the same level of consumer product that we see in some of the competing shared mobility modes. So we're really excited to have a large list of transit agency partners alongside us that opens up a lot of what we're able to do. If you go to the next slide. So I talked a bit about what the app is and the fact that we can do things like show you when your trip is arriving and connect it with a bike share or a scooter share ride, or increasingly unlock tickets. But all of that is really only possible because of a set of open standards in mobility that have been adopted over time. And I think there's a lot of really amazing success stories here around open data standards that the transit community and the transportation community more broadly should be very proud of. So if you go back to all the way back to 2005, which feels like quite a long time ago now, that was the start of GTFS, which originally meant the Google Transit Feed Specification, now means the General Transit Feed Specification. That's what lets you show scheduled data in trip planning apps like ours, but it's been expanded over time to include real-time data and a variety of other add-ons to the core feature of showing scheduled information for transit. So that's 2005. If you jump ahead 10 years later, very much modeled on that example, the bike share industry got together and put together the GBFS feed, organized by NABSA, the National Bike Share Association, and a handful of private operators to standardize the feeds around bike share that make that information available to consumers. And Transit was one of the first trip planning apps to actually start consuming that information. So that's what let you see if you have a bike available at the next station or a scooter available within a walking distance to you. So that's what we're excited about. But obviously those two things alone don't represent everything. So for instance, there is no data standard for things like ride hail and taxis, which I know about having worked at Uber for a long time, and increasingly microtransit. So on-demand services that are being built in cooperation with public transport agencies also don't have any data standard for how those are displayed to consumers. So one of the projects we're really excited about that just got kicked off and is being run by Mobility Data is building a data standard for that. We're calling GOFS. And that's a missing piece. It doesn't exist yet. And there's another really important missing piece that Gillian later on this call has been working a lot on through Cal ITP is payments. The idea of buying, I mentioned in Montreal, we can buy a bus ticket. That's because an API has been made available to us to do that, but that's far from standardized and far from widespread. And so the idea of having increasingly easier open APIs for purchasing transit tickets is something we're very focused on. And obviously beyond that, it'd be nice to be able to buy other rides too, but it seems like the public transport section is one place we can hope that payment becomes a simpler process. So I have one more slide, then I'll turn it over. So I think I want to say that despite that great progress, and I think what looks like it, when we frame it that way, is kind of a steady march to nirvana where everything is open and interoperable, I think that's far from certain. And we've seen that from other areas of technology. So I have two contrasting images here. One is email on the left, and one is Facebook Messenger on the right. And so email, if I email you from my Gmail account and you have a university account or a Yahoo account, it will get there and you don't even think about it. But if I want to message you on Facebook Messenger, I have to download Facebook Messenger to actually send you that message. And I think those are kind of two contrasting visions of how mobility might play out. Are we going to have a world where the idea of interoperability across modes is something that is so basic and ingrained in the system that it works like email, or something where each individual operator really controls their own set of modes and forces you to enter into an ecosystem, whether you want to or not? So I think it's far from certain which of these are going to be the final version. And I think a lot of times when we see MaaS presentations, these details get glossed over. But I think it's really important for people who want these visions to happen, like Regina was laying out, that you actually get into the weeds and understand how do we open up more modes, more interoperability using data standards and other public regulatory levers. So I'll stop there.
Some of my favorite topics, mobility data and regulatory levers. We're going to move on now to Gary Thomas from DART. He's done a really amazing job of building a lot of these integrations through his experience at DART. Gary.
Thanks, Regina. It's great to be here for me this afternoon, for you this morning. And I'm going to approach it a little bit differently from Andrew. We're an operating agency, and we started in the mobility as a service arena, quite frankly, quite by accident. If we go back to, in our case, go back to 2013, we were actually looking for a low-cost entry into smart card technology. And if you go back to 2013, smart cards were certainly making their debut in many cities. Several cities had already had them. And we said, wouldn't that be great from a customer perspective, a customer ease of use perspective from a payment application? But we couldn't afford it. And we had a few examples of what was going on around the United States at the time from a smart card perspective. And we said, quite frankly, we can't afford hundreds of millions of dollars to introduce a smart card. So we said, what's the next best thing? Well, use mobile technology. And again, remember, this was probably 8.5 years ago when we started this conversation. So we started down this path, went out with a procurement, of course. We had several proposers. The developer, the app developer that we chose was out of Copenhagen, had a lot of experience doing this type of thing in Northern Europe. And so that was really the beginning of our mobility as a service, but all it really was at that moment in time was the ability to plan your trip and pay for your trip on the mobile app. Interestingly, in 2013, as I was kind of going around the city talking about the new app, the new opportunity, there was this other company that was on several of the panels that I was on. This other company, of course, was Uber, and they introduced in Dallas in 2012. So just before that. And so we ended up on several of the same panels. We were pretty sure we were competitors, but we weren't exactly positive about that. We weren't sure why. But what we did figure out is that we liked each other's company. We were on a lot, like I said, a lot of the same panels together, and we developed a relationship. And over time, we said, wouldn't it be great if we were both on the same app, whether DART was on your app, you're on our app. And again, this was 2013. So long before a lot of the conversations that are happening now about shared mobility and shared uses. But we knew that, that this made sense. And we knew it because it was important for our customers as we really thought about this. And Uber the same way. Now, the hard part was Uber said, gosh, we need to get this done by Friday. Well, when you tell an agency, a transit agency like DART, that you need to get it done by Friday, of course, in our mind, that means, maybe Friday in 2 or 3 years. And Uber meant really this Friday. So that was that first opportunity for us to really understand that we were speaking in different languages. And so we started down this path working together, and it was a long and winding path. And Regina, if you go to the next slide, please. We continued on our path, and Uber continued on their path, obviously. And we looked at how we could continue to do this. And oftentimes we go to our policymakers, our board of directors, and they'd say, why are you doing this? Why aren't you going to someone like Andrew at Transit App and let them do it? We're a transit agency. We do buses and trains. We ought not to be in this space. But again, if you go back to 2013-14 timeframe, there were certainly some other app developers out there that are doing payment apps, but nobody had really started to combine all the different things. And that's where we wanted to go. And we knew the path. We knew what we wanted to achieve. So we had to explain why that was good for us. And of course, that came down to some very business oriented kinds of things like our return on the investment, reduction in cash handling, unique revenue generating partnership for the agency. In other words, using this app to identify other payment opportunities, whether it's to the basketball game or the state fair or whatever it is, using the app for other opportunities and driving people to and through that app, maybe that weren't initially really thinking about using transit. But you know, if you get a 25% discount off of your admission ticket for whatever it was, then it drove people through our app. So that, from a business perspective, that really started to make sense, and people could understand that. If you go to the next slide, so okay, fine. So we have this app. What does it do, and what do we want it to do, and what is our roadmap? And again, why are we doing it? Why are we doing it as opposed to someone else doing it? And we said, you know, it's really about the customer. Certainly, as I said before, the return on investment, all of those things are great, but it's about our customer. And if you're familiar with the transit industry, you know our version of customer service for perhaps the last 100 years has been, let's keep our buses and trains clean, let's make sure they're safe, let's try to go all the places people want to go. And if you show up at a bus stop or a train station, we're going to be there sooner or later. We're going to be there, and we're going to pick you up, and we're going to kind of help you complete your journey. What we finally started to realize at DART was maybe that didn't work for everybody. Maybe it didn't work for a lot of people, and maybe some people had to do that because they didn't have any choice. So how do we start to make this more of a user-friendly experience? And certainly, as we all know now, if you want to buy something, if you want to buy a product today, you go to an app. Without naming it, of course, we all know you go to a particular app and they'll give you 5 or 6 different places you can buy that product. They'll give you 5 or 6 different ways to pay for it, and they'll give you 5 or 6 different ways that it can be delivered wherever you want it to be delivered to. And that's what we're really trying to achieve from a transportation perspective. Again, obviously trains and buses are our business, but we realize that we've got to combine all the different things to make it work. If you go to the next slide, please. So along that journey, we also integrated our on-demand service, and that's where we really started to integrate other modes. And in that case, you know, we said, okay, we've got these different zones that we don't have good bus service. We're going to put a van, and you're going to go to the app, and you're going to say, I'm either going to that particular zone, or I'm coming from that zone, or maybe I want to travel within that zone. And the app's going to tell you when that van can be there. And our goal was having a 10-minute response time. And interestingly, our partner on that particular project initially was Toyota. And it was their North American headquarters. And they said, you know, the congestion is really bad. We need to figure out how to do this better. Well, the good news was it was a very, very successful pilot. And then we expanded it to 13 other zones, and it was very successful. The problem is when you have a 10-minute response metric, and it's very successful and very popular, you can't maintain a 10-minute response metric anymore. So we went out again with a public procurement. So we need help, we need backup. Uber Pool was the proposer that we chose to be our backup. So now if you're in the zone or going to the zone, you can pick and you can link your trips to trains and buses and connect to either the van or Uber Pool, and you as a consumer get to figure out how you want to do that. If you go to the next slide, please. And of course, also all our bookings are through Spare, our partner, Spare. We're also in the process of integrating Via now. So you can find where you want to go, you can book your trip, you can see in real time where your vehicles are as they get to you, as you're on them. As I was telling someone this week, riding a bus can be incredibly intimidating if you haven't done it before. You're standing on the corner and you expect this vehicle to stop and pick you up, and then you've got to get on it, assuming they stop, and then you have to pay. And you know, do you know how to do that? And is it going to be embarrassing? And is everybody on the bus going to laugh at you? And how is that operator going to interact with you? All those things can be incredibly intimidating until you've done it a few times. What this does also, not only planning your trip, paying for your trip, combining different modes, but it gives you a little bit of comfort level on how to do things. Next slide, please. Now, the challenge is, of course, we can't do that by ourselves. And so these are the providers and the partners as we start down this path to put all these things together. Because again, as Regina and as Andrew said, it's about bringing everybody together. It's not just about buses and trains. And then you get to one part of your journey and say, okay, I got to get off the bus, or I've got to get off the train. Now I need an Uber or a Lyft, or maybe I want the scooter or bicycle. So you've got to bring everybody together. That means everybody's got to figure out how to share. And that's where it gets a little challenging, certainly. But these are the partners that we've brought together. Now, again, as Andrew talked about paying, remember our app started as a payment app. Well, we realize now that that's also challenging because there's so many different ways to pay for things these days compared to 2012, 2013 when we first started this. So whether it be through Apple, Google, Pay Near Me, we've got to make sure that we have all those different opportunities. So people, again, it's back to the customer, always back to the customer. What does their trip look like? And how do we make that work best for them? Next slide, please. And I'll end on this slide. As we go through this process, we have to realize that each and every journey is unique to that individual. And not everybody has access to the same things in our world, unfortunately. And what we really try to do is level the playing field for everybody. Whether you want access to Uber Pool, whether you want access to trains, buses, bikes, scooters, whatever it is, or even if you're driving your personal vehicle, knowing what your other opportunities are. I always think it's a little creepy when you get in your vehicle in the morning and it says, oh, it's 6:30 in the morning, you must be going to work. It's going to take you 45 minutes today. Well, it's still creepy, but wouldn't it be better if your app said, or your phone said, oh, it's 6:30 in the morning, you must be going to work. Here are your choices, and here are how much each of them is going to cost you, and here is how much each of them is going to, the length of time it's going to take to do it. It gives everybody the same opportunity, and that's so critically important for us in our community. And Regina, thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. And I think that actually your ending on this topic is a really great transition over to Gillian, who spent a lot of work on the issues of equity at Caltrans. Gillian, are you able to start your video and I'll introduce?
I am. Hey there.
Great.
Thanks for this opportunity. So I'm not really a PowerPoint person. I'm a hopefully faceless government bureaucrat working in the back to help maximize public value. So I don't really do slides particularly well, so please pardon the form. So next slide. So here are 3 videos which I think will crash Zoom if we actually run them here. So I'm gonna, while I'm talking, I'm gonna try to put these links into the chat too. If you have a chance, grab the slides. I'm happy to share them and watch these videos. These are 3 fabulous videos of the customer experience, which is the sort of tack that I've taken in trying to approach this problem. And so the first is a video of a ticket vending machine in one of our urbanized areas in California. The second is, I think it's an ad from Apple, a customer waltzing in to buy a cup of coffee using their Apple Watch. And the third is the traditional cash transit fare box instructions from a transit operator. And the reason I bring this up is that I think, so if you think about transit from the customer, American transit from the customer experience, you really have to take the analysis all the way up to the source of the problem. So if you go to Macy's and buy a t-shirt, you hand the clerk the t-shirt and your debit or credit card, right? Because that's how most of us pay. And the clerk gives you back your card and your t-shirt in a bag. If you go to the clerk, let's pretend that experience at Macy's is a transit trip. You go to the clerk and you give them your card and they say, what's that? We don't take that. And then you say, I'd like to buy your product. And they say, how old are you? Or they say, what's your income? Or do you have a disability? And you look at them funny and they say, you're taking too long. Here's our rule book. Read our rule book. And then once you understand which rule that you want to buy off of, then there's a nice ticket. There's a nice lady over there in the corner behind the bars. She's the cashier. You can give her your money, whatever that is, and then she'll give you a ticket, and then you come back with your piece of paper, and then you can have your t-shirt, right? That's the customer experience in transit. It's extraordinarily confusing. And it's, to Gary's point, it can be extremely cause stigmatism depending on who you are. And it certainly is so friendly that it is so unfriendly that it repels a lot of customers. So I think you have to start to ask yourself, if that's your point of entry, you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? And the answer is that this is a two-tiered society. There are some people that we trust and some people that we don't. And the people that we trust happen to get a payment mechanism that comes with a bank account. And the people that we don't trust don't have that payment mechanism, even though their payment and banking are separate industries in the United States. For decades, they've been run together. So next slide, please. So the question that we started to ask in California, and I work for the state and not just one transit agency, we have over 370 transit operators in the state of California. It's a very large network. The question that we started to ask was, well, what's up with cash? Why are people paying with cash? And what could we do about it? What's the, is that a problem? Is that something that we want to do something about? So this slide features a picture which I'll present again on the next slide when we get there, but we started to ask ourselves, what do people who have one of these have that people who paid cash don't have? And the answer is an account. They have a payment account. And an account is separate from whether or not you have money in it, or should be. It's just not in the United States. So what we need is for everybody in the United States to have an account like other countries do. And then we can talk about whether or not, what kind of money we put in it. And once you have an account, you can move money in both directions. And we saw the lack of having solved this problem last year during COVID when the Trump administration sent out checks. And some of the Americans, the millions of Americans who most desperately needed that money, still haven't gotten it because they don't have a direct deposit relationship with the IRS. And even some people who do have have bank accounts or have problems with their bank accounts wound up not being able to get their money. And ultimately, Americans paid something like $67 million to check cashers to get that money because they don't have accounts. So next slide, please. So this is a terrible quality photograph, apologies, but this is an example of how transit works when you try to solve for discounts. This is one of my favorite operators here from where I live in San Francisco, the SFMTA. The SFMTA actually wants to give low-income discounts, give you a reduced price, but you have, if you qualify for a reduced price, you have to stand in a line, apparently only on certain dates in February and March based on the letter of your last name, in order to get your discount associated with your smart card. This happens every year in San Francisco, and it's better than it was because back in the old days when I first started thinking about this problem, the SFMTA used to actually collect people's income tax returns to verify that they qualified for the discount, which meant that the transit operators were storing people's income tax returns. So how discounts happen around the state of California varies by each transit operator. So there are up to 378 different ways to define senior, what kind of discount you get, or veteran. And it's an extraordinarily frustrating and difficult customer experience, even if you want to make it better, as SFMTA does. So next slide, please. So the New York Times kind of is on the same bandwagon. And once Donald Trump sent out his checks, and they didn't make it to a lot of Americans who really needed it because they don't have bank accounts, the New York Times started banging the drum on the idea that everybody in America finally needs to have an account, as is true in other countries. I personally think that I'm excited that the New York Times editorialized for this. I personally don't think that the United States Post Office or that the Fed should jump in suddenly and create accounts. I think we have a perfectly great account payment system in the United States. It just doesn't include everybody. So next slide, please. Here is a fabulous resource that you should all read, which is the FDIC does a How America Banks report regularly. And they opined that the pandemic, that COVID had really exacerbated or really revealed this sort of fundamental social safety net problem in the United States, that the existing banking regulations and requirements basically preclude about 30% of the population from participating in the financial system. Next slide, please. So it also shouldn't be any surprise, apologies again for the quality of the slide, that there are a lot that we've done some studies about why this is true, and those are that people don't have enough money. Banks require typically a minimum deposit, and many Americans can't afford that. So in California, it's about $300 is a minimum deposit that you're required to give to a bank in order to get a digital payment method. And that is more than Californians can afford. And so they either don't have a bank account, or they keep that $300 there and then don't use that bank account for fear of going below the minimum balance. That complication, that set of rules varies by banks. And so I think, to me, that makes sense of why you see the second statistic here, which is that has led to a lot of people not trusting banks. And the associated fees, if you do drop below that minimum balance, are extraordinarily high. So next slide, please. This is my final slide. You should see that you should see, and I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone, that the brunt of this lack of financial empowerment is disproportionately affects young people and people of color. So it happens to be that a lot of the people who are who've caught in the short stick on the short end of the stick and the social safety net in the United States are also transit riders. And so transit can turn the whole problem sort of on its head and say, look, transit is the canary in the coal mine for the problems with the American social safety net. And this is the right place really to think about this problem so that everyone has an account. So this, I think, is my next slide. Here's my next slide, please. Here's some things that you all should read. These are sort of incredibly powerful policy documents that I think are extraordinarily helpful for everybody to read, to really understand kind of what's going on, and that transit really faces. And then I think the next one really is my final slide. Ta-da! That's our website, CaliforniaMobilityMarketplace.gov. This is where we're publishing the things that we do, and that's our email address. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gillian. I like to think that I work on some of the tough problems in transportation and mobility, but thank you for the humble reminder that you are actually working on some of the really challenging problems out there, and appreciate the work that you do. All right, well, we're gonna go ahead and dive into questions and conversations. I do have some pre-populated questions that I had planned for our illustrious panelists here. I feel like we should kind of treat this like a podcast, but do keep in mind that everything is being recorded and is going to be shared on the Urbanism Next website. So let's go ahead and dive on in. I'm gonna stop my screen share so that we can see everyone's faces, and encourage the audience to populate questions for us to answer. So, I think I'll kick off with questions about how cities are emerging from COVID. I think there were a lot of questions about which business models were viable. You have a lot of shared mobility service providers that have probably realized delivering transportation services for a profit is actually quite difficult. And so I want to ask, what you see the role of policy playing, for instance, with regards to what services might be subsidized if cities believe they are part of the solution for sustainable transport. And maybe Gary, you could kick us off with what are your thoughts on that question from a transit agency perspective?
Sure. In Regina, as you know, she and I just served on a TRB committee that produced a report titled "The Role of Transit, Shared Modes, and Public Policy in the New Mobility Landscape." And the first thing that you have to have is a community that is all working together to solve this problem. And quite frankly, as we went through our process, that started to emerge as one of the largest obstacles in the whole thing. And it's how to get, in our case, we have certainly the city of Dallas, but if you have Dallas, Fort Worth, and the other 80 suburban cities that are in the North Texas area, plus 3 transit agencies, plus, plus and plus and plus. And you have to expect everybody's going to get on the same page. It's hard. And, I was on an APTA trip, I guess not too long ago, 2019 now, where we went to several cities in Europe and in different countries, different cities, different countries, and Austria and Germany and Finland. And each one of those, when we went to visit and talked about mobility as a service, everybody was on the same page. And everybody had a common focus and a common mission. And it was all about climate change. And everybody was, at least from our perspective, the visitors coming in, everybody was around the table talking about doing that. That's hard. And so when I came back, all pumped up and enthusiastic about that, and I get in front of a bunch of mayors from the North Texas area, and I said, it's all about climate change. Well, you might imagine what the response was, but still, it's how do you get your policymakers to get on the same page? And during the pandemic is exactly the right time when we need to be talking about that, because certainly now ridership is down for transit, and I won't speak for the other modes. Cars are coming back. The Toll Road Authority here reports that they're at 80% of where they were pre-pandemic. We're at about, we're probably closing in at 55% ridership of pre-pandemic. So it's starting to come back. But now is the time when we ought to start, because we know it's going to get back there. And if you're out and about during the middle of the day, that the traffic is there. People may not be, the traffic patterns have changed. They're not morning rush and evening rush anymore, but throughout the day, our traffic patterns are changing. And so, how do you start to combine all the different modes and really start to serve the customers and provide that equitable service that most of us desire and think we need so badly?
Yeah, that makes, thanks, Gary. And also for raising the issues of climate change as well, which was probably a politically challenging environment. Gillian, I guess, can you also speak to what do you think should be subsidized and how should we subsidize services, and including, the layer of complexity around the number of people that are unbanked?
So I guess I'm not comfortable answering the subsidy question because I think that that's a fair policy and sort of social safety net policy issue. I guess what I would say is I'm an implementer and I'm working on fair payment systems and making sure everybody has an account, which is like the amount of money that we spend not solving this problem, we should better spend on actually giving people discounts. What the most expensive money to collect is cash. It's about 15 to 20, but anywhere between 15 and 25 cents on the dollar to collect a dollar. It's very expensive. Clipper and tap type products, smart card products, cost about 12 to 16 cents on the dollar, which is a significant improvement over cash, but it's still quite expensive. Credit card fees, credit and debit card fees are 2%, 2-3%. And other countries have pushed them down quite a bit. So that's a huge difference. And Transport for London really went first, right? So like that's free money before you have to subsidize. And if you can provide that piece and give somebody a general purpose account that they can also use to buy coffee with, or they can also get different programs that brings them onto the map, that has this sort of brings this exponential value. So I think we like to have a lot of policy arguments, and I don't do that. I'm tired of that. I would just like to build the plumbing that we so desperately need. It's cheap. There's plenty of people who are willing to give it to us. We just need to think about it and look at our contracts. I mean, I will say the final piece on this is when I first started in 2018, some transit operators were kind enough to share their mobile app contracts with us. And remember, we have over 370 transit operators in California. So to get across California, one of my colleagues has a folder in his phone that has all the apps in California, right? It's over 80. So that's ridiculous. I mean, but if you start looking at those contracts, what I very quickly realized, is that sort of a lot of wool was being pulled over the transit operators' eyes. And that is that they thought they were getting a custom app. They generally weren't, because it didn't make sense for the app provider to customize it for a teeny tiny market share, which is what transit is. Like, let's face it, on a good day, we had 5% of the mode share in California. If we were a business, we would be out of business. So what really you were buying from the mobile app vendors, and what really you are buying from the mobile app vendors, is a tiny amount of software development, and where you're paying your money is an upcharge on payment processing. So what we saw in California was we have one of the most low-cost, inexpensive payment processing contracts in the country. You're required to use it if you're a state agency. And it's more in line with 2%. What some of the transit operators were signing up for without really understanding their contracts, because the contracts were being issued by marketing departments and not by Treasury departments, was what we were seeing was some transit operators were paying upwards of 16% in payment processing, which is, from my view, probably a Title VI issue. And it doesn't really get you anything universal, because the benefits of that app end with your service area. So, subsidy is one thing, and then there's just like good business sense.
Yeah. I don't want to touch the procurement contracts question too deeply, but I think that we could have a much longer offline conversation about what are the complexities around contracting, especially when it comes to payment systems, not just mobile apps, but also, hardware baked systems that are very difficult to kind of rip out and change.
Well, one thing to say though, to just since we're at it, is that states have something that no local agencies have, which is that state procurement arms can purchase things on behalf of an entire state. And if a state procures something, laws allow local agencies to rely on the bigger fish's procurement. It's kind of like a get out of jail free card.
I can see Andrew taking notes, so I want to hear Andrew's thoughts on this issue and some of the other questions that have been raised.
Gillian, we actually do that. We actually take advantage of the state of Texas buying power on many items.
You sure do.
And so it's helped us quite a bit.
The Texas DIR is amazing. In fact, if I could get you guys to buy a bunch of stuff for me, that'd be awesome. I'm not allowed to buy off of Texas because we take that personally in California, I guess. So maybe we can stand up our own, but yeah, no, it's absolutely, the Texas DIR is, in my opinion, the gold standard of government procurement. It gets better every year, less expensive. And if you look at who's buying off of it, there are over 35 local agencies in California, and some of them are transit operators that purchase off of your procurement.
Yeah.
You guys are angels.
Good purchasing and procurement. Andrew, what are your thoughts on I guess maybe I like to maybe shift gears a little bit, but you're welcome to address any other questions that have been brought up. And I think that, one of the questions I know we've talked about before is around how can public agencies enable an open ecosystem for mobility as a service, especially when it comes to mobility data? Who should own that data? Where should that data be shared? What is the role of public authorities in ensuring that the data isn't captured in a walled garden?
Yeah, sure. And I'm sure your other panelists who I know have strong views and lots of experience in this one as well. But I think, from my perspective, one of the reasons I came over to work at Transit, having previously worked at Uber, was that I think one of the things that I saw was there was so little conversation from the public side of the table on consumer-facing apps. And maybe Gary's an exception, and Gillian to some extent exception also. But I think there's been so much focus on data that goes from the operator of a service to the regulator, whether it's things like the taxi commission monitoring hours of service or, archived trip records. All these things are important, but, almost no attention was being paid to, well, how does the consumer actually find and discover whatever kind of service we're talking about? So Gillian mentioned, white label ticketing apps on the public transport side, but also just the ability to find and pay for new mobility services, to be able to find the prices for those things. I think a lot of the services that in this space are becoming more complicated in the prices they offer people, and I think more restrictive on where those prices are actually displayed. So one of the things that I'm really focused on is how do we, fight for a system that's interoperable among the different both public and private operators, which I don't think is just a matter of kind of holding hands and saying kumbaya. I think there's some people who don't want that to happen, whether explicitly or sort of implicitly. So I think we have to kind of want that to happen. So we've been working that on small ways, right? I mentioned this bit about GOFS, which is the idea of replicating even just the API to find and discover services that doesn't exist for many of the services that are out there. That seems like a small step in a direction of saying we're actually going to have a consumer-facing multimodal system that you can find and discover a whole wide variety of services, which right now is not possible, even just to find and know where those things are and be able to book them. As Gillian points out, once you get into the payment world, it gets more complicated. But to me, if we can't even solve the bit of like, here's what's available, here's how you can do it, here's how you can plan it, people can't even get to that next step. So I think there is a large role for public agencies to think about inserting themselves a little more clearly into that space. And that's not brand new. I mean, GTFS exists because public agencies ultimately found the way to ask for it and push their vendors who did their scheduling and the things to publish it. GBFS is, in every or most bike share and scooter contracts across the United States. And I think you could find something similar for other modes of transportation, just on the discovery part. So to me, that's the easiest piece. If we can't do that first, in addition to all the hard payment work Gillian's talking about, it seems like we're not going to kind of get to the place we all think, or many of us who come to events like this think we should get to. Yeah, so I think it's both a technical problem, but we should be honest that it's also a political and commercial relationship problem where not everyone wants this to happen for some of the reasons that have been talked about throughout the panel.
Well, it's interesting. I was just having a conversation this week, actually partly motivated, I think, by the work that you're doing, Gillian, on how do we think about data and ensuring that it is available in the places we want it to be available. And I asked the question, to what extent have procurements, for example, on-demand transit required any sort of data? And is anyone who is doing those procurements familiar with the effort to create GOFS? And the general answer is not really. And so I think there's a real challenge in tying the data standards and requirements to the procurements that are happening for on-demand transit, or for bringing micromobility into transit, or even in the case of, I think, permitted micromobility programs, we typically almost always at Populus will see that in the set of requirements that the city puts in place to permit scooter companies to operate, there will be a requirement for MDS, the mobility data specification data. But there won't always necessarily be any requirements related to GBFS so that those services can be discovered.
Mm. Right. In fairness to GOFS, it only exists as a concept right now. I know
okay.
Heidi from Mobility Data is here, so she knows that work is going on. Working group kicked off last week, and if there are people who want to get involved, we welcome that. And I think Mobility Data welcomes that too. So it's an exciting start. And I think, as Heidi said, in theory, the MDS standard requires a GBFS fee, but I think you're right. What I've discovered since I've been at Transit as a consumer of that data, not so much a producer, is that you realize something you sort of took for granted was happening everywhere is really not. And even if you require it in the contract, do you actually check on it? Or frankly, are people using it? I think obviously use is what drives people to make sure that they're enforcing and following up on those contract requirements. So even GBFS, which I think is like, relatively non-controversial in a sense, is not universally asked for or enforced. So we've got a long way to go even on the stuff that we sort of had a green check mark on in one of my slides.
Well, and the other thing we've got to be careful about, Andrew, and you touched on it, is the privacy. I mean, not all data obviously is private, but the privacy of specific information relative to specific people. The open records laws in Texas, we're actually going through the legislature right now to protect people's individual data.
Yep.
And we don't think the bill will get any opposition, but everything we do is open, right? And so that also becomes somewhat of a challenge for us to make sure that we protect the right data, and then make sure that the other data is available to everybody that needs to see it.
So you're bringing up a question that I often find really fascinating. When I think about data in the transportation realm, I like to categorize it typically into 3 different buckets. One is that there's data about the physical infrastructure that public authorities can collect and are generally responsible for managing, such as curbs, streets, et cetera. Then there's the data that comes off of systems that are usually procured by the public. So for example, parking meters, transit agency, ridership data, and so forth. And then the third bucket is private fleet data, which are commercial fleets, including scooters, but also Uber, Lyft, et cetera, which are data that are important for making decisions and which public authorities can now more easily require be delivered. But there are these 2 first buckets, which are really kind of under the authority and management of public agencies. And what are some of the challenges and what are some of the solutions, particularly related to that second bucket of you have systems that have been procured. How does that data become more easily usable for mobility as a service and mobility management?
So from our standpoint, Regina, and we've talked a lot about this internally, and as we think about where we're going with the GoPass app specifically, the hard part is we don't have the people to deal with the data that we get. Many times we get, and we talk about, we're going to get all this data and it's going to be really cool, and we're going to be able to do this and this and this, and we're going to be able to refine our services to make it more efficient and all these things. And then we find ourselves just drowning in data that we don't, and you see this all the time, I'm sure, that we really don't know how to use effectively and efficiently. And so consequently, and it's hard for us to go to our board and say, you know what, I need another 10 positions to manage this other thing that I want to do that's a lot more entrepreneurial. And they always look at me and say, Gary, you're dreaming again. Let's focus on buses and trains. But yeah, it's a challenge. So we have to figure out, how do we bring partners in that help us resolve that? Whether it's and we've talked about transit app, and Andrew's aware of this. How do we? I love the idea of sharing and having interoperability. But how do we do that? How do we share that data? And it's going to take someone like yourself to help us sort through that.
Andrew, can I ask a question, and Gillian as well? I guess, to what extent are the challenges of using that data baked into the lack of standardization of that data, as opposed to legacy contracts and vendors making that data available to other maybe software solutions that can help support efficient economical analysis of it?
I think it's both. I mean, I think, like you have to, so I don't know, I'm stuck on the basics here, right? Which is like, we don't know where our stuff is, and we don't know how to, it's not digitized. Like I think we have a mainframe that has our right-of-way maps on it in California, right? It's very laborious to get data out of, right? So like, that's got to stop. Like we issue the mapping standards for the state of California. So it's no surprise that, it's just like the Fed, right? Like, we don't have real-time payments in the United States, like everybody else in the world does, but the Fed has ancient systems. And so it's unwilling to regulate real-time payments because it itself can't process them, right? So the DOTs are sort of the same, right? We are antiquated. And so we're hesitant to make everybody, hold everybody to a higher standard, but it's not exactly comparable, right? Because it, like, certain things make sense to be in every agency, in my opinion, but certain things make sense to be shared, right? Like payment processing, it's just basic plumbing. It doesn't make any sense for everybody to have their own, have to procure their own payment processing contracts. You can't get the economy of scale. Just do that kind of thing, basic things in one place. And then you only have to hire a few people who are specialists and they stay on top of it, right? Like that's what we should be doing. That's what DOTs should be doing. So they should be owning that function, and they should also know, they should enter the realm of standards, right? Like one of my most heartfelt wishes, and you know, you're gonna record this, so I have to be careful here, but look, for Caltrans to tell all of the transit operators, thou shalt GTFS, requires us to enter a rulemaking process officially, if we want to do it officially, which takes 5 years. Transit will be gone by the end of this year if we don't get everybody on real-time GTFS. I'm not kidding. Like this is it. So a 5-year rulemaking process that, you know, that was designed, that would require action from the state of the legislature to amend, is like a non-starter, right? Like everything about our processes is 1950s. So yes, we need both. I think we know what the standards are. There's a fair amount of agreement about that there should be standards, and there are willing partners. We have a history of doing this in the United States. Like we had some argument about adding the third prong in outlets in the 80s, but like we got it right compared to other countries. So I don't think achieving standards is really a problem. It's implementing them, which is like just good management. And some of it should be centralized. And yes, everybody's special, but like, do we have to make our own decisions about absolutely everything?
On your point, Regina, before about things that are being procured, I mean, I think that is a place where some of the stuff's being driven adoption-wise. I mean, the microtransit thing, I think, you know, for better or for worse, there's been kind of a boom, I feel like, in microtransit over the course of COVID. And in those places, when you're Uber or anybody else and you're asking for public money for a ride, you seem to be much more willing to adopt new standards for service. So I think there's a really powerful place that you've seen work quite well. It doesn't mean it covers the whole of what's happening in a market, but that seems like those kinds of procurements are a way to drive adoption of these things. And especially people get together and don't just do it, you know, operator by operator, to Gillian's point, but across the country, or, you know, state by state, people can say any contract of this type will have this thing in it. I mean, I think those can move action very quickly that I've seen happen kind of just in the last few years in certain places.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Well, we're basically right at time. I appreciate you all for joining us as part of this conversation. And I always love bringing the conversation to the more complex topic of data standards, procurement. I think these are all topics that we want everybody in the public sector and the private sector who want to deliver services to the public sector to be well versed in. So appreciate you having this conversation with us today. Thank you so much for being part of it. And thanks for all the great work that you're doing. Have a good one.